A single dad was set up with an obese CEO, then he treated her like no one else did. The first time Daniel Reyes saw her photo on his sister's phone, he almost said no. Not because of how she looked, but because he had promised himself after his wife died that he would never again let his heart be handed to a stranger on a screen. But 3 years of raising a 6-year-old alone had worn him down in ways he didn't like to admit. And when his sister begged him to just have one dinner, just one, he finally said yes. He had no idea that single dinner would end up changing not just his life, but the life of a woman who had spent years believing she was unlovable. If this story moves you even a little in these first few lines, hit like, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Daniel was 34. A contractor who built houses with his hands and rebuilt his own life one exhausting day at a time. His daughter Mia was the center of his universe, a bright, chatty little girl who still asked some nights why her mommy wasn't coming home. Daniel never dated. He worked, he picked Mia up from school, he cooked dinner badly, and he fell asleep some nights still in his work boots. His sister Carla worried about him constantly. She was the one who set up the dinner, insisting that her friend from her old job, a woman named Vanessa Cole, was someone special. What Carla didn't mention until the day before the dinner was that Vanessa was the CEO of a mid-sized logistics company, a woman who had built her business from nothing after a divorce that left her with debt and a broken sense of self-worth. She also didn't mention that Vanessa was a big woman, someone who had spent her adult life being underestimated, mocked behind her back, and quietly excluded from the kind of love people assumed she didn't deserve. Vanessa had said yes to the date reluctantly, mostly because Carla had worn her down the same way she'd worn Daniel down, and partly because some small, stubborn part of her still hoped. When Daniel walked into the restaurant that evening, he saw a woman sitting alone at a corner table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the menu like she was bracing for something. He noticed the way she glanced up when he approached, a flicker of something like fear crossing her face, as if she expected him to turn around and walk back out. He didn't. He pulled out the chair across from her, introduced himself, and asked if she'd already decided what she wanted to eat. Vanessa would later tell Carla that this was the moment she almost cried right there in the restaurant. Not because Daniel said anything extraordinary, but because he didn't look at her the way other men had looked at her on the rare occasions she'd tried dating. There was no visible calculation in his eyes, no polite mask hiding disappointment. He simply looked at her the way he might look at anyone, with open curiosity, and asked her about her day. Over dinner, Vanessa found herself talking more than she had in months. She told him about the company she'd built, the sleepless nights during the years she nearly lost everything, the quiet ache of eating lunch alone in her office because she didn't want her employees whispering about the CEO who never seemed to have anyone waiting for her at home. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt with advice or steer the conversation toward himself the way she'd grown used to. When she finally asked about him, he told her about Mia, about his wife's accident, about how some mornings he still reached for the other side of the bed out of habit before remembering. They didn't fall in love at first sight. This isn't that kind of story. What happened instead was slower and in some ways more powerful. Daniel called her 2 days later, not because Carla nudged him, but because he found himself thinking about the way Vanessa had laughed once during dinner, a real laugh, surprised out of her, as if she'd forgotten she was capable of it. Their second date was a walk in the park because Vanessa suggested it, almost testing him, expecting him to make an excuse about the weather or his schedule. He showed up in sneakers and brought a soccer ball because Mia had begged to come along, and Vanessa spent an hour laughing as she tried, badly, to keep up with a 6-year-old's demands for goal celebrations. It was during that walk that Vanessa first understood something had shifted. She noticed Daniel never once suggested a restaurant with a smaller table, never hovered near her with a hand ready to help her up as though she were fragile, never made the small comments people made when they thought they were being kind. Comments like "you carry yourself so well" or "you have such a pretty face." comments that always carried an unspoken but underneath them. He simply treated her like a person, the way he would treat anyone he was falling for. The following months brought both warmth and struggle. Vanessa's mother, a woman who had spent Vanessa's whole life commenting on her weight with the excuse of concern, was horrified when she learned Vanessa was seeing a widowed contractor with a young daughter. She told Vanessa she was settling, that a man like that could never really want her, that he was probably after her money or looking for a mother for his child rather than a partner for himself. Those words cut deep, reopening wounds Vanessa had spent years trying to heal. There were nights she nearly ended things with Daniel before they'd truly begun, convinced that she was protecting him from the embarrassment of being seen with her, convinced that eventually he would realize what everyone else already seemed to know, that she wasn't worth the trouble. Daniel had his own battles. His mother-in-law, still grieving her daughter, struggled with the idea of Mia growing attached to someone new. Co-workers on job sites made crude jokes when they saw a photo of Vanessa on his phone, the kind of casual cruelty that men sometimes think is harmless. Daniel found himself, more than once, having to decide whether to laugh along to keep the peace, or to say something and risk the tension it would create. He chose every time to say something. Not loudly, not in a way that turned him into a hero in his own story, but firmly enough that the jokes stopped being made in front of him. If you've ever had to defend someone you love against people who couldn't see their worth, you already know how much courage that takes. Let me know in the comments if you've ever stood up for someone the world underestimated. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening, nearly 5 months into their relationship, when Vanessa had one of the worst days of her professional life. A merger she had spent a year negotiating collapsed at the final hour, costing her company a devastating contract and putting dozens of jobs at risk. She drove home in a daze, barely holding herself together, and when she walked through her door, she found Daniel already there, having used the spare key she'd given him only weeks before, cooking dinner in her kitchen with Mia coloring at the counter beside him. He took one look at her face and didn't ask what was wrong. He simply walked over, wrapped his arms around her, and held her while she finally let herself cry. The kind of crying that comes not just from one bad day but from years of swallowed hurt. That night, after Mia had fallen asleep on the couch and the kitchen had been cleaned, Vanessa told Daniel everything she'd never said out loud, about the years of dieting that never worked the way people promised, about doctors who blamed every ailment on her weight before even examining her, about ex-boyfriends who dated her in private but never introduced her to their friends, about the quiet, grinding loneliness of building an empire while feeling invisible as a woman. Daniel listened without flinching, and when she finished, he told her something she would remember for the rest of her life. He said that he hadn't fallen for her despite anything, that there was no despite about it, that he had fallen for her exactly as she was, her mind, her humor, the way she remembered small details about Mia's favorite cartoons, the way she worked harder than anyone he'd ever met and still found time to ask about his day. From that night on, something in Vanessa began to soften. She stopped bracing for the moment Daniel would change his mind. She started introducing him proudly to her board members and her closest friends, no longer hiding the relationship the way she'd hidden past ones out of fear of judgment. Daniel, in turn, found himself healing in ways he hadn't expected either. Vanessa's steadiness, her willingness to sit with him through the harder nights when grief for his late wife still crept in unexpectedly, gave him a kind of peace he thought he'd lost forever. Mia adored her, not because Vanessa tried too hard to win her over, but because she simply showed up, again and again, at school plays and skinned knees and bedtime stories, until showing up became who she was to that little girl. Not everything was easy even then. There was a painful evening when Vanessa's mother finally met Daniel and made a cutting remark at the dinner table about how lucky Vanessa was that someone had finally looked past her size. The table went silent, and Vanessa felt the old shame rising in her chest, ready to apologize on behalf of her mother the way she always had. But before she could speak, Daniel calmly set down his fork and said that he didn't look past anything, that Vanessa's size was simply a part of her, no different than her sharp mind or her kind heart, and that if anyone at the table needed convincing that she was worth loving, the problem wasn't Vanessa. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, and then, for the first time in years, Vanessa's mother looked at her daughter differently, as if seeing finally what everyone else had somehow learned to see first. A year after that first reluctant dinner, Daniel proposed to Vanessa on the same park bench where Mia had once demanded a goal celebration. He didn't stage a grand public spectacle or hire a photographer to capture the moment for social media. It was just the three of them, Daniel, Vanessa, and Mia, who had begged to be the one to hold the ring box until the very last second. When Vanessa said yes, Mia cheered louder than anyone, throwing her arms around both of them, already calling Vanessa her new mom before the adults had even caught their breath. Their wedding was small, intentional, filled with people who had watched Vanessa transform from a woman who ate alone in her office to a woman who laughed freely at her own table, surrounded by a family she never thought she'd have. Vanessa's company thrived in the years that followed, not despite her personal happiness, but because of it, because a woman who finally felt secure in who she was led with more confidence, more clarity, and more compassion for the people who worked for her. Daniel kept building houses, and every evening he still came home to the two people who had rebuilt him just as surely as he had helped rebuild her. What made this love story different wasn't some dramatic rescue or a Cinderella transformation. Vanessa never became smaller to be loved, and Daniel never asked her to. The love between them grew precisely because he refused to see her the way the world had trained her to see herself, and because she was brave enough eventually to believe him. Their story is a quiet reminder that real love was never about fitting into a size or a shape or an expectation. It was about being seen fully, flaws and struggles and all, by someone who chooses you anyway every single day without conditions. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they are worthy of real love exactly as they are. Your support means more than you know, and it helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you believe that everyone, no matter their size, their past, or their circumstances, deserves to be loved fully and without conditions, type the words "I believe" in the comments below. Let's fill this space with reminders that love was never meant to have a shape. Vanessa Cole no longer eats lunch alone in her office. Most days now, she comes home to a kitchen full of noise, a little girl asking for extra sprinkles on her ice cream, and a husband who still looks at her the exact same way he did on that very first night, like she was never anything less than enough.